Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into something that feels, well, both ancient and completely modern. It's this engine, right? The
Right.
one that drives people to just abandon their individual lives and become part of something bigger, something fervent, collective.
Exactly. We're talking about mass movements, the kind that rally millions, demand absolute loyalty, they inspire incredible sacrifice, but also sometimes horrifying brutality. What is that force?
How does it capture people so completely? That's the question.
It's a phenomenon that's shaped history again and again, from early religious crusades right up to modern political upheavals. And today, our deep dive is pulling insights from a really foundational work. Eric Hoffer's The True Believer.
Hoffer, right? He wasn't just looking at the slogans or the specific beliefs.
No, not at all. He looked at a huge range, religious, social, nationalist movements and found these, well, startling commonalities, not in what they preached, but in the underlying human dynamics and, crucially, the types of people they attract.
That's the real hook, isn't it? The why people join, maybe more than what they're joining.
Precisely. So our mission here in this deep dive is to walk through these excerpts from Hoffer, try to understand that deep appeal mass movements have. Who are these potential converts he talks about?
And explore those really powerful, unifying forces that forge these, fervent followers, people ready for action, ready for self-sacrifice. We're trying to see what makes them tick, according to Hoffer.
And Hoffer's central idea, his premise, is that no matter the specific message, all effective mass movements share these essential characteristics, and they draw from similar kinds of people.
They don't just recruit people, they sort of transform them.
Totally. They generate this readiness to die, this united action. They cultivate fanaticism, enthusiasm, intense hope, but also intense hatred, often intolerance. Blind faith, single-minded devotion. It's that shared psychological ground, not the ideology itself, that fascinated him.
So the core isn't the specific belief system, but the human need the movement plugs into.
Exactly. And one of the biggest needs Hoffer identifies is this profound desire for change. Mass movements are often these incredibly powerful vehicles for drastic, rapid societal change.
He gives historical examples, right?
Yeah, like Islam uniting scattered tribes, or Christianity organizing parts of Europe, the Crusades, the Reformation. They fundamentally shifted things.
And he connects it to modernization, too. Things like Japanese nationalism driving industrialization, or Ataturk in Turkey.
He does. He even notes how historically anti-Western feelings sometimes played this modernizing role, shaking parts of the East out of stagnation. Hoffer observes that people who manage to enact huge change often feel they have this irresistible power.
Like the French revolutionaries with their faith in reason, or the Bolsheviks and Marx, or the Nazis with their leader and propaganda and blitzkrieg.
Right, but that feeling of power isn't quite enough on its own. They have to inspire something more almost irrational.
Yeah, absolutely crucial. Hoffer really stresses this. Transformative leaders don't just tap into discontent or make logical points. They have to ignite and fan this extravagant hope.
Extravagant hope? Like what?
Well, whether it's a heavenly kingdom, a utopia on earth, incredible riches, world domination, national glory, whatever it is, it's this outsized hope that pulls people forward. He points out how the communists focused more on preaching hope than just dwelling on misery. That was more powerful.
And he makes that interesting point that this drive for change doesn't only come from the underprivileged.
Correct. Hoffer, maybe a bit provocatively, argues that revolutions can be kicked off by the privileged too, driven by the hope of massive gain. He uses the English enclosure movement, the Industrial Revolution, basically. Revolutions driven by the rich, excited by new tech and the hope of huge profits.
So whether it's saving your soul or making a fortune, hope is this incredible fuel. But okay, beyond change, Hoffer talks about the appeal being about substitutes. Yes, movements offer these potent substitutes for a life that feels, spoiled, empty, lacking something vital. They mainly appeal to the frustrated.
Not just adventurers looking for gain.
Yeah, adventurers might join, sure. But the real energy, the vigor of a movement, Hoffer says, relies on its ability to tap into and satisfy that deep human passion for self-renunciation, losing yourself in something bigger.
And when does a movement lose that energy?
When it starts attracting too many careerists, people just looking out for themselves, then, Hoffer says, it's becoming more like an enterprise, less like a movement shaping a new world. It's lost its soul.
That idea of self-renunciation,
Hmm.
He has that interesting bit about minding other people's business.
Right. He sees things like intense gossip, meddling, or getting totally absorbed in group affairs as basically ways of running away from a self that feels meaningless. Instead of dealing with our own emptiness, we obsess over others or the group's drama.
And the idea of having a holy duty to others, how does that fit in?
Hoffer sees that burning conviction, sometimes not purely as altruism, but as a way for what he calls drowning selves to grab onto a passing raft. It looks selfless, but often it's about survival.
So taking on these big duties gives you self-esteem back.
Yeah, potentially a huge boost.
Yeah.
It can transform a life that felt self-centered and pointless into one that seems selfless and worthwhile.
So the deeper the frustration, the more desperate the need for something outside yourself to give life meaning.
Precisely. All that intense dedication, devotion, loyalty, self-surrender, Hoffer often frames it as a kind of desperate clinging. Clinging to something that gives worth to a life that feels futile. And the substitute, whatever it is, has to be embraced totally, uncompromisingly.
And the readiness to die.
That's the ultimate proof in this view. Proof that this substitute identity is the absolute best thing possible, worth more than the original self.
Wow, it really shifts the focus away from the external cause, doesn't it? More onto the internal state of the person looking for escape.
Absolutely. And he suggests these frustrated individuals aren't just looking for one specific movement, they're almost like interchangeable raw material for any effective movement.
That's one of Hoffer's core and maybe most uncomfortable ideas, right?
It really is. People ripe for one mass movement are often ripe for any that comes along and resonates. Think about Germany before Hitler. Young, restless people might swing towards the communists or the Nazis.
Or in Tsarist Russia, he mentions Jewish families with members drawn to both revolution and Zionism.
Exactly. Converts, Hoffer says, can and often do switch allegiances between totally different movements.
And the leaders seem to understand this about their rivals.
They often do. Hoffer notes how proselytizing movements often see the zealous followers of their enemies as prime potential converts. Hitler apparently saw German communists as basically National Socialists who hadn't realized it yet. Captain Rome boasted he could turn the reddest communist into a nationalist fast.
They recognized the underlying energy. The type of person was similar, just pointed in a different direction.
Precisely. They're all tapping into that same reservoir of frustration and readiness for total dedication.
So mass movements are competitive, but also interchangeable.
Surprisingly so, yes. A religious revival can morph into a social revolution, which can feed into nationalism. It's fluid. Zionism, he points out, blends nationalism, social change, and for many, religious feelings. Irish nationalism is deeply tied to Catholicism.
Which suggests that one way to counter a movement might be to promote another one.
That's a strategy Hoffer discusses. You might neutralize a social revolution by fostering a religious or nationalist one. He suggests where Catholicism regained its mass movement energy, it served as a buffer against communism. In Japan, nationalism channeled social unrest. In the American South, racial solidarity acted as a brake on potential class conflict.
And fundamentally, he sees them all as a kind of migration.
Yes, in essence, every mass movement is a journey towards a promised land, literal or metaphorical. And sometimes actual physical migration makes the movement much stronger. Think of the Puritans coming to America, the Mormons going west, or the Zionists returning to Palestine.
Okay, so we've got the appeal change, hope, substitutes for a flawed life, this idea of interchangeable recruits. But who are these people specifically, beyond just being frustrated?
Right, and this is where Hoffer's analysis gets really sharp and maybe uncomfortable for some. He argues that a group's character, its destiny, isn't just shaped by its best people. Often it's the inferior elements, the failures, misfits, outcasts who play this huge role in driving change alongside the most capable.
Why them?
Because, he argues, they lack reverence for the way things are now. They're reckless. They crave dissolving their spoiled individual selves into something collective. They are, in his pretty provocative phrase, the raw material of a nation's future.
So the people society might look down on are actually key to its transformation.
That's his argument. And he spends a lot of time on the poor, but makes some really key distinctions. He highlights that the most fertile ground isn't always the absolutely destitute, but the new poor.
The new poor, meaning?
People whose poverty is relatively recent, They have that vivid memory of better times, and that contrast fuels the frustration, the readiness for change. He points to the English peasants kicked off their land by enclosures feeding the Puritan Revolution, or the ruined German middle class backing the Nazis and fascists.
And big disruptions like war can create this group, even if the economy technically recovers.
Exactly. Hoffer talks about how Hitler's population shuffling and the chaos of war broke up families and communities in Germany. It prevented people settling back into stable, conservative lives, even when things got economically better after the war.
So what about the abjectly poor, the ones who are truly hopeless?
Hoffer suggests they're often too caught up in just surviving day to day. They lack that necessary spark of extravagant hope that a mass movement needs to ignite.
He also talks about the unified poor. What's that distinction?
Right. Poverty experienced within a strong, cohesive community, like a tight-knit religious group or tribe, makes it much less likely for mass movements to gain traction within that group. He uses the example of Jewish communities in the diaspora, often being resistant to the surrounding society's upheavals because of their internal cohesion.
So conversely, when that cohesion breaks down,
That's when trouble starts, in his view. A lot of the unrest in developing countries, he argues, came from the crumbling of traditional tribal or village solidarity, often due to contact with Western individualism.
giving people individualism sounds positive, but Hoffer sees a downside.
For individuals who aren't equipped, internally or materially, for that sudden isolation, yeah, it can lead to this profound loneliness and a desperate scramble to find new group bonds, which often takes the form of fervent nationalism.
He contrasts that with, say, Japan's modernization, which kept group structures intact.
Right, or even the Soviets moving into new territories. They didn't just conquer, they immediately offered a new, tight collective structure to replace the old one they were dismantling. He even applies this to labor unrest, suggesting fostering team spirit and group incentives in factories might be more effective at preventing mass action than just focusing on individual wages.
And he uses the modern Jewish experience as a key example of this loss of a corporate body, as he calls it.
He argues the Enlightenment and assimilation weakened traditional Jewish communal bonds. This led to individual isolation and frustration for many, making them potential converts for various modern movements until Zionism offered a powerful new collective identity. He notes the tragic irony that Hitler's destruction of families and communities in Europe made this worse isolated individuals facing enemies alone, compared to the collective strength seen in Palestine.
So it's that loss of belonging, feeling adrift, that makes people search so fiercely for a new group.
That's a central point. He also briefly mentions other types susceptible. The bored, whose aimlessness breeds restlessness, sinners, seeking refuge and purpose, and perpetual misfits who never felt they belonged anywhere in the first place.
Okay, so we've identified this pool of potential converts, the frustrated, the isolated, the misfits, people seeking something beyond their individual self. How does a movement take this mix of people and forge them into a single, unified, self-sacrificing force? This feels like the real alchemy here.
It requires, as Hoffer puts it, stripping away the individual self. That readiness for united action, for self-sacrifice, it requires the person to lose their individual identity, their distinctness. They have to become fully assimilated into the collective, whether it's German, Russian, Christian, whatever the label is.
So your purpose, your worth, even your existence gets tied up entirely in the group.
Exactly. As long as the collective body lives, they feel like they can't truly die. It's a kind of immortality.
You disappear into the group to gain a new, maybe more potent identity.
Essentially. For someone feeling utterly alone, life might seem fragile, but being part of an eternal race, an eternal cause that grants a kind of strength, enables courage. He uses that stark contrast again, isolated European Jews under Hitler versus the collective resistance in Palestine.
And keeping people from identifying with anything outside the group is vital.
Yes, he points to things like the Iron Curtain. It wasn't just about state secrets. It was about preventing Russians from identifying with any group outside Russia, blurring that sense of shared humanity with others.
So how do they actually foster this willingness to sacrifice the self, even life itself? Hoffer lists several mechanisms.
One he highlights is make-believe. Dying, killing it becomes easier when it feels like part of a ritual, a performance, a big show. Leaders are masters at creating this illusion. The theater of war, the uniforms, flags, parades.
Glory is a theatrical concept.
Exactly. You sacrifice your temporary physical self for this imaginary eternal self that exists in the eyes of the group, of history. Armies have perfected this.
It ties back to losing the individual self. trading it for something bigger, more lasting.
It does. Another mechanism is the deprecation of the present. Mass movements almost inevitably shift focus. The present gets lumped in with the hated past, and all eyes turn to a glorious future.
How does that work?
Things like setting totally impractical goals, fostering faith in miracles, embracing mysticism, they all serve to devalue the ordinary, imperfect present moment.
So if today feels worthless, sacrificing it for a promise tomorrow seems less of a big deal.
Precisely. And this is crucial, this only works because of the assured hope of that glorious future. The promised land, utopia, the final victory. Without that unwavering hope, devaluing the present just leads to despair and people looking out for themselves. He uses examples like the Donner Party or the horrors of Buchenwald, no hope, no unity.
Glorifying the past helps too.
Yeah, making the present seem like just a brief, messy interlude between a golden past and an even better future.
Okay, what about doctrine? That seems like the absolute foundation.
For Hoffer, doctrine serves as this essential fact-proof screen. Truth exists only within the doctrine. Any experience, any observation that contradicts it, that's heresy. Ignore it, suppress it.
So blind faith requires disbelief in everything else.
Pretty much.
People.
Like the Japanese soldiers refusing to believe Japan had lost, or communists dismissing any bad news about Soviet Russia. The power is in the certitude, not necessarily the logic or truthfulness.
It doesn't even need to be understood, just believed.
Exactly. A doctrine's effectiveness comes from its absolute certainty. Hoffer quotes Pascal saying we're often most certain about things we don't understand. Understanding can breed doubt. He also argues the frustrated person wants this. They dislike messy facts. They crave salvation through the miraculous. They basically ask to be deceived.
That's a really challenging thought, that people actively want that fact-proof screen.
It's key to his whole analysis. The doctrine Hoffer suggests, again citing Pascal, should ideally be contrary to nature, to common sense, and to pleasure. If it's not totally unintelligible, it should be vague, unverifiable. The frustrated are more open to this. It's an escape hatch from a reality they can't stand.
Okay, so we have hope, devaluing the present, rigid doctrine. What fuels the sheer intensity we see in true believers?
That's fanaticism. Hoffer sees it as absolutely necessary for driving drastic change. You achieve it by stripping away individuality, and it's fueled by intense, often violent passions. It frequently paints individual, autonomous existence as fundamentally wrong or evil.
And the fanatic themselves.
Is deeply insecure, Hoffer argues. They find assurance only by clinging passionately, blindly to the cause. That intense attachment is their security, and they're willing to sacrifice their life to prove their worth to the cause. Interestingly, he notes that ex-fanatics often don't become moderate. They just find a new cause to surrender to completely.
So beyond these mechanisms for self-sacrifice, what other forces really weld individuals into this cohesive mass?
Hoffer identifies several really potent ones. The most accessible, the most comprehensive, he argues, is hatred. It's incredibly effective at pulling people out of their isolated selves and fusing them together.
A mass movement needs a devil.
Absolutely needs one. A tangible enemy. Hoffer quotes Hitler saying, if the Jew didn't exist, they'd have had to invent him. He contrasts this with the Japanese movement, noting they struggled partly because they lacked a ready-made internal enemy like the Jews for the Nazis. Smart leaders pick their enemies carefully.
And where does that really intense, unreasonable hatred come from?
Hoffer often links it to self-contempt. It's a way to project your own feelings of inadequacy or guilt onto others. You hate in others what you despise or fear in yourself, and you need allies in this hatred.
He also makes that disturbing point about wronging people fueling the hate.
Yeah, that to wrong someone makes you hate them more because the alternative is facing your own actions, your own guilt. We often have to hate those we've wronged to avoid self-contempt.
And he has that controversial idea about sublime religions breeding hatred.
Right, suggesting that by setting impossibly high standards, they inevitably create guilt in followers because nobody can live up to them perfectly. And that guilt, paradoxically, can fuel hatred and brazenness directed outwards. The more sublime the ideal, the more virulent the potential hatred it can generate when people fall short.
And he notes how oppressed groups can end up imitating the oppressors they hate.
Yes. The evil done lives on, he argues, because those who hate it most often end up shaping themselves in its image. Fanaticism molds the world in its own harsh way, creating both converts and bitter enemies who adopt its methods. And hatred is costly. You can destroy the very things you claim to be fighting for.
And that de-individualization process you mentioned earlier.
is also dehumanization. Hoffer points out the torture chamber is a corporate institution. It works by stripping away individuality in both the victim and the perpetrator. It enables acts individuals couldn't commit alone. Hatred isn't just a tool for unity, it's also a product of it. When you lose personal responsibility in the group, you gain what Hoffer starkly calls the right to dishonor.
The right to dishonor. That's chilling. What about imitation?
Also crucial. For uniformity, for one-mindedness, it's a primary way the mass shapes individuals. The less happy you are with yourself, the more you want to be like others. It explains the imitativeness often seen in oppressed groups, for example.
It's a shortcut.
Exactly. When you lack the inclination or ability to figure things out yourself, just copy everyone else. It takes less effort. Hoffer notes that bustling, action-oriented places tend to produce uniformity faster.
And being unified actually increases this tendency to imitate.
Yes. Someone who's lost their distinct self in the collective is kind of incomplete, highly susceptible to the models the group provides. Hoffer highlights how movements warn fiercely against imitating outsiders, calling it treason or heresy. They use mechanisms to cut off contact, sometimes even physical migration, to enforce this.
Controlled uniformity, carefully shielded. What about persuasion and coercion? We hear a lot about propaganda.
Hoffer is, again, provocative here. He argues propaganda is often overrated. Totalitarian movements, he claims, rely far more on sheer brutality, the sharp sword. In fact, propaganda often becomes more intense and effective when it's backed up by coercion.
Coercion itself can be persuasive.
It can. It can even breed fanaticism. Someone forced to conform might end up just as fanatical as someone genuinely persuaded. Hoffer insists that relentless coercion has an unmatched power to convince over time.
So persuasion alone isn't enough for big, lasting movements.
He finds very few historical examples where it was. He points to Christianity, Islam, the Reformation, the French Revolution, communism, all relied heavily on force at key moments. Where possible, he says, coercion is preferred over persuasion, which seems messy and uncertain. He quotes St. Dominic, where blessing can accomplish nothing, blows may avail.
Holy terror.
Once unleashed for a cause, it often knows no limits. And crucially, Hoffer adds, you need faith both to resist coercion and to exercise it effectively.
What about proselytizing, that drive to convert everyone else?
Hoffer often sees this not as a sign of strength, but of deep inner doubt, of insufficiency. It's a search for validation, for proof. A movement whose legitimacy feels shaky often has the strongest urge to convert others.
Why?
He links it to a contradiction between the movement's claims and its reality. This creates guilt or a sense of deficiency, which gets projected outwards as this fervent need to impose the belief on others. The more communism struggled in Russia, the harder they pushed for world revolution. Southern slaveholders got more zealous about spreading their way of life as its problems became clearer. It's a symptom of an internal lack.
Like trying to convince yourself by convincing everyone else. And the leader. How crucial are they?
Indispensable, Hoffer thinks, but only when conditions are ripe. A leader can't just create the widespread desire to follow or the deep dissatisfaction. That has to be there already. But once the stage is set without a compelling leader, the movement often just fizzles out. Figures like Lenin, Mussolini, Hitler, he sees them as absolutely essential to their movement's success.
What makes a successful mass movement leader, according to Hoffer?
Audacity, a joy in defying norms, iron will, fanatical conviction, absolute faith in their own destiny, a capacity for intense hatred, contempt for the current system, cunning, a flair for symbols and spectacle, total brazenness.
And attracting good lieutenants.
Crucial. Being able to evoke that mystical sense of communion with followers and holding the loyalty of capable deputies. Intellectual depth, less important than boundless self-confidence and what Hoffer calls the arrogant gesture.
And he mentions charlatanism and imitation as key traits. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, but he insists some level of charlatanism is indispensable. No mass movement succeeds without deliberately misrepresenting facts, feeding illusions. And leaders are often incredible imitators, borrowing methods from anywhere, friends, enemies, past, present. The daring is as much in imitating as in defying. He even speculates this extreme imitation might mean the leader themselves lacks a fully formed individual self, much like their followers.
And for the followers, obedience is fundamental.
Second only to faith itself. Even when they're committing violent acts, the true believer is fundamentally obedient, submissive to the cause and the leader. Personal independence works against unified action. That leads to pioneers or bandits, not disciplined members. He notes the disciplined Nazis or Japanese military, or how a racial fanatic in the U.S. South could be both violent in a mob and a docile factory worker. Obedience is to the group goal.
Action itself is also a unifier.
Absolutely. Just being involved, marching, building, fighting it reduces individual distinctness. Hoffer contrasts the man of action with the thinker. Action breeds uniformity. He suggests the sheer scale of action involved in settling America helped assimilate diverse immigrants quickly. Action creates camaraderie.
And it can renovate stagnant societies.
Yes, mass action can energize a passive population. That's another reason it seems vital for modernizing countries stuck in decay. But there's a warning. Successful action can become an end in itself. It can drain the original fervor, become routine, and ultimately kill the collective spirit. People focused purely on action, like the Anglo-Saxons he mentions, tend to be less revolutionary.
He adds suspicion to this list, too. That feels weird. How does suspicion unify?
It is counterintuitive, but Hoffer argues it's potent. The frustrated, being very aware of their own flaws, are quick to spot flaws in others. This self-awareness sharpens their eye for others' imperfections. When they gather, there's this undercurrent of mutual suspicion, everyone watching everyone else.
And that constant watching leads to conformity.
Paradoxically, yes. Knowing they're being judged, the faithful try desperately to avoid suspicion by adhering rigidly to the rules, the opinions, the doctrines. Strict orthodoxy can stem as much from this mutual suspicion as from pure faith. Loyalty points upwards to the party, the church, the nation, not sideways to fellow believers. Close personal ties can even be seen as weakening the group. So yeah, mutual suspicion can actually be a source of corporate strength.
Okay, so after all these forces strip away the self and forge this unified mass, what are the actual effects of being unified on the people inside?
Hoffer makes another slightly strange point here, that being thoroughly unified actually intensifies all those unifying inclinations. The hatred, imitation, credulity, obedience, suspicion, even after the original frustration that drove them in, might be gone.
That seems odd. If you found your place, why would those things intensify?
Because Hoffer sees the unification process itself as fundamentally one of diminution, not addition.
Diminution. How so?
To be assimilated, you have to be stripped of your distinctness, your free choice, your independent judgment. Lots of impulses get suppressed. What looks like positive additions, fervent faith, hope, pride, often come from a negative place. Relief from the burden of being an autonomous individual. He shares that quote from a young Nazi, "We Germans are so happy we are free from freedom."
Wow. Free from freedom. That really nails the paradox, doesn't it?
It does. Their happiness, their strength comes precisely from not being their old individual self. Attacks can't hurt that self because it's gone. Endurance comes from the collective connection, not personal resilience. And people raised entirely in these movements, Hoffer argues, can end up as fundamentally incomplete dependent people long after the initial crisis has passed.
Okay, so we've covered the appeal, the people, these intense unifying forces. What about the life cycle of these movements? Do they just go on forever?
Hoffer sees distinct phases, often with dominant personality types. First, you get the men of words. These are often intellectuals, writers, speakers. They prepare the ground, articulate the discontent, discredit the old ways, create that hunger for faith and change.
But they often want something different from what the masses end up wanting.
Yeah, Hoffer notes the tragedy. They often preach freedom, but the masses they awaken are primarily seeking escape from the burden of freedom, seeking collective belonging.
The intellectuals light a fire they can't control.
Often. Then come the fanatics. They're crucial for the active, revolutionary phase. They drive it with absolute certainty, ruthless dedication. But, Hoffer notes, they can't settle down afterwards. Their energy, their hatred often turns inwards, leading to purges and infighting.
And finally, you get the practical men of action.
Right. They consolidate things after the chaos. They're more about order, preserving the gains, than about keeping the revolutionary fire burning. They often rely on force, borrow methods from anywhere, even former enemies. They maintain the appearance of the original faith, but they're really driven by pragmatism and stability.
And that active phase itself.
Yeah.
Is it a time of great progress or creativity?
Hoffer argues, no. The intense, active phase of a mass movement is often sterile for creativity. The demands of fervor, propaganda, constant action, blind faith, they just drain creative energy and blind people to nuance. Long active phases often lead to stagnation, periods that look like dark ages creatively.
So creativity thrives before or after.
Generally, yes. During the preparation, the articulation phase, or more often after things settle down or the movement starts to decay and individuals regain some autonomy. The peak collective fervor isn't the peak of individual expression.
What makes some movements stay in that fervent, unified state longer than others?
Several factors. One is the nature of the population itself. People already used to submission or strong discipline, like he suggests Russians, Germans, or Japanese were, can sustain it longer. He quotes Madame de Stael on the Germans being vigorously submissive.
The leader's personality matters, too.
Hugely. Leaders like Stalin or Hitler were masters at keeping the dynamic going, prolonging the active phase. Hoffer contrasts them with rare leaders like Lincoln or Gandhi, who he sees as willing to curb the movement's worst aspects and even dissolve it once core goals were met, prioritizing something beyond just perpetual fervor.
Okay, finally, Hoffer explores this really controversial idea, the notion of useful mass movements.
Yeah, useful. After everything we've just discussed about the hatred, the loss of self, the dehumanization, it sounds jarring.
How can they be useful?
Well, he argues, looking purely historically, they can be brutal but effective tools for waking up and renovating societies stuck in deep decay, societies that can't seem to change otherwise. He points to Russia, India, China needing these upheavals to break free from stagnation. He even argues that not being able to produce a mass movement when needed can be a handicap, citing pre-revolution China and Spain.
So upheaval is better than slow decay in this view.
That seems to be his controversial point. And a key factor, he notes, is having an articulate minority that's not tied to the government. Their voice is vital for potential change.
And foreign influence often plays a role, but indirectly, not changing society itself, but creating the conditions.
Exactly. Foreign influence often works by creating or alienating this articulate minority who then become the spark. Muhammad, influenced by foreign ideas, sparked Islam. The Renaissance and Reformation were spurred by rediscovering other cultures. European influence clearly fed into the Bolsheviks, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, Ataturk in Turkey, direct responses to foreign influence setting movements in motion.
So foreign ideas are like a catalyst, creating the conditions for this internal engine to fire up.
Precisely. The mass movement becomes the final, violent link in the chain that shakes a society out of its slumber.
And lastly, he touches on fanaticism itself being an invention.
Yeah, drawing on JBS Haldane, who provocatively listed fanaticism, specifically Judaic-Christian fanaticism, as one of the few truly crucial human inventions between ancient times and the Renaissance. Hoffer acknowledges it's often seen as a malady of the soul, but also, paradoxically, sees it as a miraculous instrument for raising societies and nations from the dead. A brutal, but sometimes historically necessary tool for resurrection.
An instrument of resurrection powered by stripping away the individual, fueled by hatred, demanding blind faith. It's a powerful and, frankly, deeply unsettling picture Hoffer paints.
It really forces you to look past the slogans, doesn't it? To understand the raw, sometimes dark human drives and psychological gears grinding away underneath these huge historical shifts.
Okay, let's try to wrap up the core takeaways from Hoffer's perspective in this deep dive. Mass movements, fundamentally, offer escape, belonging, and this kind of extravagant hope, mainly to people feeling frustrated, isolated, or that their own life is spoiled.
And they draw from this common pool of potential converts who are surprisingly interchangeable between different movements.
They create these incredibly fervent, unified followers by systematically stripping away individual identity.
And relying on powerful unifying forces. Unwavering hope for the future, deliberately devaluing the present, rigid, fact-proof doctrine, intense hatred of an enemy, imitation, coercion.
And often a specific type of leader who embodies that energy and certainty.
And while Hoffer concedes they can be these brutal engines of major historical change,
He argues it comes at a huge cost, a cost to individual freedom, critical thought, and creativity, especially during their most intense phase.
that captures the essence of his challenging analysis from these excerpts, yeah.
So, bringing this back to you, listening to this, trying to make sense of the world, how do Hoffer's ideas give you maybe a different lens? A way to look at current events, understand group dynamics, or just recognize the powerful, sometimes seductive pull of passionate causes you see?
Well, they give you a framework to look beneath the surface, right?
Yeah.
When you see that kind of fervent collective action, that intense loyalty, that readiness for radical steps or sacrifice, Hoffer prompts you to ask deeper questions.
Not just what are they fighting for?
Exactly, but also, who are these people fundamentally? What basic human needs are being met by losing themselves in this group? And what psychological forces are being used, consciously or unconsciously, to keep that unity, that fervor going?
Okay, and here's a final provocative thought to leave you with, building directly on Hoffer's unsettling observations. If the true believer finds strength, purpose, even a kind of happiness, mainly by shedding their individual self and dissolving into the group, if they see individual life as futile, maybe even sinful, what does that really tell us about our fundamental human need for belonging, for meaning?
And maybe more importantly, what is truly gained, but what is also profoundly lost when that deep human need gets channeled into the all-consuming pursuit of a holy cause. What really is the cost of being free from freedom?